Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I know it's been a little while since we last connected in this format. I hope everybody had a nice holiday and their 2021 is off to a good start. As you may recall, the last time we were together, we pulled a lot of resources from our office to discuss potential election outcomes, how those could impact tax legislation going forward, and how those could impact markets going forward. Well, now that we've got a clearer roadmap, we thought it'd be a good idea to reconvene. Because these are pretty meaty topics, what we decided to do is break these into two parts. So this week we've asked Bud Watson to come back and walk us through, kind of in review, what we think the Biden-Harris tax plan could look like, and also provide us some updates on kind of what we've learned since the last time we were together. Next week at this time, we'll bring James Faraday back, talk about how the election results, how we think those are going to impact the market now that we've got a clearer lay of the land, and what we can expect out of markets in 2021. But for today, we are going to focus on tax changes and how that could impact financial plans for our clients or just for those in attendance. So I'm going to bring Bud Watson in. Bud, how you doing this morning?
Good morning, Clint. Doing well, thank you.
So I've got up on the screen a resource that you provided back in October, and it's just a bullet point review of some of the tax proposal that was linked to the Biden-Harris campaign in late October. So I thought maybe if you wouldn't mind just revisit that for us, and then we can jump into what some of the new items might be.
Sure, Clint. Yeah, a lot of what I've done, certainly my whole career as a financial planner and a CPA, is trying to balance current law, primarily tax law, and with proposed legislation, and that's a tricky balance. Obviously, as is still the case, most weight goes to current tax law. That's the law we have in play, but I think it's smart to keep an eye on what could change, what the impacts might be, and that's magnified right now as it was 4 years ago, because we have the party that occupies the White House also controlling the House and the Senate. So there was very swift and broad tax legislation and changes immediately after President Trump was elected, and that raises the risk that these changes could happen very quickly this time around. So I do think it's wise to just review these, give everybody a chance to just think about them, talk with their advisors, so that when and if we do have to make a very quick decision, we're doing it in a way that has been reasoned and thought through for impacts other than just the tax impact, which always worries me that we make rash decisions purely based on taxes. So looking at the slide that we reviewed last fall, the increase in corporate tax rates is still on the table. Keep in mind that prior to President Trump's administration, the rate was 35%, so his administration lowered it to 21%. Biden has proposed pretty consistently kind of splitting that in the middle and going back to 28%. And I think the likelihood of that happening is fairly good. And I think for our clientele, other than the impact, which we could talk about next week, on investments and corporate profits, would be for our clients with small businesses to really think about their entity structure. There would have been changes possibly made to a C Corp structure 4 years ago to take advantage of that low tax rate that now may or may not make sense. So I think we should get together and chat about entity structure and see if any changes make sense to make there. The next one really is, again, sort of impacts next week more than this week, but if large companies, primarily the public companies, are having to pay a tax potentially on book income and thereby more taxes than they're accustomed to, what impact does that have on our client's portfolio? So I think we'll save that one. That'll be part of our discussion next week. the like-kind exchange elimination, that's worrisome because that's been a long used, really as long as I can remember, strategy for our clients who own commercial real estate. The availability of like-kind exchanges has been sort of pecked away at over the last few years, but it's still a predominant planning strategy for clients who own real estate. So, obviously one strategy there would be just to go ahead and enter into a like-kind exchange sooner rather than later. One of the interesting advantages of like-kind exchanges is they have various dates where elections can be made that go up to 180 days after the initial exchange. So that may give a client an opportunity to elect to do a like-kind exchange, and then if the law doesn't change, to go ahead and just unwind it with later in the year. So that's certainly worth conversation if you have real estate that you're considering selling. Increasing the top rate, really sort of going back to, again, the pre-President Trump years, back to the 39.6, and there's some conversation that this only impacts those who are quote unquote earning, it's not a defined term, over 400,000. That would lead likely to strategies of just trying to level out income, not bunching income in 1 year, if that could be done, to sort of keep recurring income under the 400,000 threshold. The next topic is a big one, gets perhaps the most press, but is
I think this is the one we're hearing the most about, isn't it?
It is, and it's pretty extreme, with the fact that we would have in effect a doubling of the capital gain rate by converting it back to ordinary income rates. And that would cause, and it's presumably that's only those with gains over $1 million, maybe income over $1 million. We're not really sure if it's just the gain being over $1 million or total income. But that would certainly lead us to think about whether it makes sense to go ahead and sell securities or other assets that qualify for capital gain treatment now, and try to beat any possibility of that rate impacting you and doubling the tax. It also could, back to the installment sale, could make some sense for some properties that qualify for installment sale treatment, like real estate, to go ahead and sell it on an installment sale basis. That way, if rates do increase, you could elect out of the installment sale basis and throw the whole gain back into at the point of sale, and maybe still take advantage of the lower rate. So those are the kind of strategies we would be looking for, ones that give us a little flexibility as these rules develop over the next few months. The next one maybe doesn't get as much media attention, but certainly from a planner's perspective, it's the impacts of it are sort of mind-boggling. But that would be to eliminate our basis step-up at death. And what's particularly worrisome about this provision is that President Trump initially supported it at the beginning of his term. So this potentially has bipartisan support and is potentially a fairly significant revenue raiser, and that would perhaps put it at the front of the line for possible enactment. But one of the concerns would be, does that just mean that when you pass, your heirs take over your lower basis, or is your passing actually a recognition event, meaning that all of the built-in gain is taxed at the date of your death, which would be just really, really challenging for a lot of estates that may have appreciated property but no cash. And so that one will be heavily debated, but I do think it's, I am worried about that one. I think it really needs to be thought through. Charitable planning and using CRUTs and CRATs and charitable trusts, giving away low basis assets now to beneficiaries, those would be the kinds of things we would be thinking through from an estate planning. standpoint. The wages over 400,000, we've heard a lot about this. Right now we have Social Security taxes apply up until your wages exceed 142.8. That's the number for 2021. But then they cease. Medicare tax continues to apply, but the Social Security tax does not. So the proposal is to bring the Social Security tax back in, the full tax at 400,000. And so that creates sort of what we would call a donut hole between 142.8 and 400. Now that some of the planning ideas there would likely focus on restructuring how a high-paid executive or person is paid. You might use options or S-corp distributions instead of a wage. You'd be looking for ways of compensating someone that didn't kick in this particular Social Security tax. Next is another worrisome one from an estate planning standpoint. This, as many of these provisions are part of the first year plan, the TCJA that President Trump had enacted. Many of these provisions, this one included, are set to expire anyway at the end of 2025. So the conversation initially would be around simply accelerating the reversal of the estate tax exemption from the current 11 million plus to 5 million, maybe plus inflation. Also, though, now that the White House also has control of the Senate, it's possible they could push for an even lower exemption, and they've thrown out 3.5 million quite a bit. So that would really put a lot of our clients in the crosshairs of the estate tax who weren't before. We really need to start thinking about that again. And, current gifting would be something we would think about as a way to go ahead and try to take advantage of the larger exemption while we have it, maybe going ahead and setting up a GRAT or a GRUT now before they would get potentially legislated out. And, some sort of flexibility in the document of a gift is, I know a lot of clients have asked about, is what if I make a transfer that's sort of contingent in some way, that if the estate tax exemption is not cut in half or is not reduced, it just becomes null and void. The transfer never took place or reverts. And using some sort of disclaimer gets mentioned a lot, but that's something worth talking about with your estate planning team to see if there are ways to sort of take advantage of the law, whichever way it ends up going. Itemized deductions getting limited. That goes back to an age-old strategy of bunching deductions in certain years. That's a pretty low impact item because not too many folks itemize anymore. So Clint, I think from revisiting the prior rules or the prior slide, back in the fall, we basically mentioned these changes. Now, as you can tell, there's some thought being given to strategies to start to address these, and those will continue to develop over the next few months. So we would encourage conversation about those.
So as we kind of take that in and assess what that means for our clients, I know that we've discussed internally that some other items have come into sharper focus since the election has played out. Do you want to start to get into what some of those are now?
Sure, and and as this has developed, of course, when we did the presentation in the fall, we had candidate Biden, who had his own website, and that's where most of this came from. But now we've had a website for transition plan website, and now a White House website. So we have had some items that have been added to the platform. So I think the first one, Clint, is the dividends, clarifying that had been a question raised before that it's capital gain rate is in effect doubling. Well, how about dividends, which have somewhat the same tax rate benefit as capital gains currently? Well, that has made its way to being part of the potential changes. So that would really have impacts on our portfolio structure, and that's perhaps something to cover more in depth next week. But would that mean that interest-producing securities suddenly come more into favor than they were before because no longer do dividends have favorable tax rates? Next, the 401k strategy. That one came up right around election time, but it was mentioned that President Biden thought that the current construct of 401k and IRA deductions was unfair in that higher wage earners got more of a tax benefit because their tax bracket was higher than lower wage earners. So he had proposed and has currently proposes a change to that, in that 401k and IRA contributions would generate a tax credit that would be the same for everybody and across the income spectrum. And that obviously, to me, that for a lot of people, maybe that's not a major change. For our highest income earners, though, that could, depending on the rate they use for the tax credit, which I think will probably be in the mid-20s, that means that they're going to have a significant decrease in the benefits. So that may lead to conversations about other types of qualified plans that aren't, that don't have this credit applied to them, and maybe would bring into focus some of the other retirement plan strategies that are out there to replace or assist and promote those as part of a plan to include a 401k perhaps in some other kind of qualified plan. The other, and I think it's been mentioned, President Biden has mentioned a couple of times, he's not throwing out the whole TCJA that President Trump had enacted, but in his mind, key provisions. If you read above, you can kind of conclude it's everything that, for the most part, it's things that raise taxes. There are some, and we'll get into a couple of those, but there are more. There are a number of beneficial changes to earned income credit, child care credit, and a variety of credits that typically apply to those in lower income categories. But I think the two that we want to mention here are potentially impactful to our clients or family members of our clients. And the first would be a homeowner credit, a first-time home buyer credit. I know this just from having a conversation with my own daughter last week, who would be a first-time home buyer. As soon as I saw this, the potential $15,000 credit. Now that's a whopping amount, and would really change the economics of down payments and so forth for many first-time home buyers. If that were enacted later in the year and she were to close on a house first half of this year, that would be quite frustrating. So we have talked in her case that maybe you rent for a little while, and let's see if that home buyer credit comes to be, and then that would be a real home run to get that credit later on. And the other one would be the potential forgiveness of federal student loan. And to me, that means let's hang on to them for now. I believe interest has now been forgiven through the end of March, I believe. So there's really no cost to hanging on to them right now. But I think it would be wise to wait out the potential for changes to student loan forgiveness. May or may not qualify. There may be all kinds of limitations on it, but I think given that there's little to no cost of waiting, I would recommend that we just, anyone with federal student loans or family members that have them, just sit tight for now, and let's see if there's an opportunity forgive some or all of those. So that covers, Clint. I think bottom line to me is just let's think about these things. Let's just assess them, talk through them, consider how they might impact your personal circumstances, and at least that way, eventually, when we do get forced to make a decision, you will have taken the time to think it through and make a reasoned decision on these that won't be just panicked because some sort of tax change happens and is immediately enacted. And
so Bud, as we look at these items, and this might be a bit of an unfair question because I didn't prep you for it, are there things in there that are more or less likely to occur? Are they all about equally likely? And then is there timing on some that will come earlier versus timing on others that will come later, or is that probably its own webinar?
Well, it may be 3 webinars, but
Sure.
I think the ones that I'm most concerned with would be the estate tax exemption and the basis step up. I do believe that primarily because not only are particularly the exemption, that's simply an acceleration of a change in the law that's already set to happen. So politically, it can be presented as not new law, but simply an acceleration of something already in the law. And also, it only affects a small percentage, at least currently, of taxpayers, far less than 1%, and mostly, if not exclusively, wealthy people. So you have a lot of, you have much less political friction to get that change than you may on a number of the other items. So I think, to me, that's one that probably needs the most immediate attention. And probably worth, it's part of your question, addressing the potential that we could have retroactive application of these rules. And that is worrisome. There is precedent for legislation, tax legislation, to pass during a year, in the middle part of the year, even the latter part of the year, and have it retroactive all the way back to January 1. I think given what's on their plates in Washington right now, we're probably a little less worried about that than we were late in the fall, because there's just so many things on the agenda that getting to tax changes is probably going to take a little while, but it can't be totally excluded as a possibility. So that's why I think those two in particular just need to really talk through and see if there are any strategies that would make sense to go ahead and set up.
Suffice it to say, it's probably a decent time for anyone with a financial plan to revisit that to make sure it's still on course.
Sure, of course, yes. And part of the benefit of having the plan is it's much easier to exhibit the impact of some of these changes long term on a particular client. We're not just doing it based on a theoretical number. We can actually incorporate these changes into your plan and see what impact they have long term.
Very good. Well, Bud, thanks very much for the time today. We certainly appreciate it. For those viewing, I know we occasionally get some feedback that the slides are kind of small on the screen. So when we post the video to the website, we will post this slide along with it, so that as you're reviewing, you can follow along just by opening that link. As I stated before, we'll have James Faraday on next week to revisit the election piece of the investment piece of the pre-election webinar that we did. And we'll certainly be tackling some of the corporate tax items and the capital gain information that Bud reviewed for us today. Bud, thanks again for the time, and to everyone viewing, thanks for viewing, and we will see you next week.